Okay, so who is anonymous? The network that protests the Church of Scientology, I've met a number of people, and they tend to be people of different walks of life, including ex-Scientologists who now protest the church. I don't think that there are a whole lot of people like lawyers and doctors involved in Anonymous, in part because I think they're just too busy. Wouldn't be surprised. I met a physicist once who went to one of my talks, and he gave me a whole lot of detailed comments. And I'm like, well, if you're not in Anonymous, you should closely follow it. So I wouldn't be surprised, again, if there are people who come from geeky domains, which can mean everything from being a web designer to being a physicist, right? Who could, in theory, participate. The arm of Anonymous that supported WikiLeaks, I haven't really gotten a sense as to who they are because they're a bit more protective of their identity, understandably, for legal reasons. I do get the sense that some are very seasoned activists, that they've participated in many other political domains and actions, and others really have come to politics for the first time through Anonymous. And so it's kind of got that spectrum, and that some are kind of super anti-capitalist, and others are more libertarian. They don't mind capitalism, they're just for free speech and against dictators. So it allows people to have different types of politics from a liberal left spectrum. There's not a whole lot of people on the right, and in fact, especially in the United States, there's anti-anonymous hackers, such as the Jester, and others who really don't like Anonymous and are very critical of them and also engage in attacks against them. There's a lot of Europeans, definitely a lot of Europeans. And it's funny, I think per capita, there's probably more Europeans than Americans, but because the United States is so big, there's definitely a good chunk of Canadians and Americans. And that is something you can tell because of the time of participation. So, no hackers up really early. So if it's early in the morning and there's a bunch of them talking, they're in Europe, right? So you can kind of tell. And there's Germans, there's a lot of people from the Netherlands. The UK has a sizable bunch, which is not surprising. Sweden, these are kind of important nodes for hacker geek activity in Europe, right? Oh, there's Italians as well. And you can also tell where they're from because every once in a while there's an operation for a specific country. So Op New Zealand, Op Italy. There's just one for Colombia. So there's definitely, and there's a channel, Pound Hispano, for all the Hispanics, right? So you can start to sift through and get a sense of the national makeup. And it is quite diverse on Anonymous. The roots of Anonymous lie on an English image board called 4chan, where people post or start a thread by posting an image, but there's different forums for different topics. And the name Anonymous was used by people who would band together to engage in internet trolling. A target would be chosen, and trolling would entail things like splattering people's personal information online, ordering unpaid pizzas to people's homes, and these sorts of things, right? And 4chan is not the only place where trolling happens. Trolling has a very kind of diverse ecology. And so Anonymous was one of these kind of trolling names that were called into being. And then in 2008, Anonymous trolled the Church of Scientology. And through a set of kind of contingencies, one kind of group of people decided to go ahead and organize street protests against the church in February of 2008. And that was kind of the moment where one arm of Anonymous grew some political roots. The name was still being used for trolling on 4chan, but this kind of movement grew on internet relay chat and forums. And then in September of 2010, a different political arm under the name Anonymous and leading operation called Operation Payback sprung into being to protest the Motion Player Association of America. And so now there's kind of two distinct political arms of Anonymous, as well as the name still called into being for trolling.
So it is a very loosely organized group.
So with the trolling, it can be very loose. With the political arms, while there's, no kind of leaders who are taking charge as to what's to happen, you can find them in the sense that there's forums where they post. So the Church of Scientology protests have a forum called Why We Protest, and there's just so much material there about debates and decisions of what should be done. And then the other arm of Anonymous, not exclusively, but for a large part, they meet on internet relay chat, of which there's, dozens and dozens and dozens of channels, but only kind of a handful that are quite popular. And so a lot of the organization happens through consensus and conversation on these internet relay chat channels. It is, in the sense that, and the world kind of chooses the targets too, because something happens in the news, like with WikiLeaks and PayPal, or with Sony suing a hacker, and people are like, hey, check this out, look what's happening. Do you think we can actually take them down? So that's part of the kind of conversation. Do we have the power in terms of resources to DDoS, Sony, PayPal? And so, for example, there was a lot of interest in taking Amazon down, but people are like, we don't have the power to do that, so why are we doing this? So a lot happens on IRC, and then people will maybe set up polls where people can vote as well. And so some have been based on voting, and then there's also documents that are written collaboratively, where people say, how about targeting this, how about targeting this, how about targeting this, and then people respond saying no, yes, and for whatever reason. So it really builds from kind of a multimodal conversation. Yeah, not with all of them, but many of them. I think web activism and digital activism is so diverse, where you have kind of the most leftist hardcore activists with groups like May 1st, Autistic, Rise Up, that are kind of card-carrying anarchists, although I don't think you're a card-carrying anarchist, you're a card-carrying communist, but anyways, to kind of very classically liberal sort of activists into government transparency, to activism on the right as well. And it takes many different forms, from very loose ties on Facebook where, hey, sign this petition, to things like free software, which I see as a form of activism in a weird sort of way because it intervenes in intellectual property. So I don't think that there's any kind of general makeup to what web activism looks like. And so I think Anonymous will be appealing to geeky types, and yet geeky types come in many different packages, so not all geeky types will be attracted to Anonymous, if that makes sense. But it's not just like completely fully open to everyone. It is, because there's no barriers, but people just wouldn't know what to even do once they arrived on these channels, right? So the barriers are just cultural capacity, as opposed to any kind of formal barriers that are kind of erected. Yeah, it's interesting, because I would say in the past, oh, they really perk their ears get perked, or eyes get perked when it concerns internet censorship and information freedom. That's something that there's a lot of commitment to. And I didn't, if you had asked me 6 months ago, would Anonymous ever get involved in social movements in the Middle East? I'd be like, no way, right? And they did enter through the question of censorship. It was when Tunisia blocked WikiLeaks, where they're like, hey, let's get involved. And if WikiLeaks had never been blocked, perhaps Anonymous never would go in the gates. But once they were in the gates, I think that shifted things, and they saw the power of contributing to an existing movement against a dictator. And since then, you know, the kind of scope of what was possible and what they would be involved in has grown in some ways. But it was a kind of almost accident, like so much with Anonymous. I mean, I definitely have some kind of normative opinions, but I tend, you know, since I'm more of a researcher, to try to understand what they do, how they do it, and, you know, try to understand, can we consider this as civil disobedience? Can we not, given certain traditions? And I do think that while there are definitely dangers to proliferating DDoS as a political tactic, only because it can be used so crushingly against the weak. So you're a small NGO, your servers are attacked, and you can't get them up for 3 weeks, right? This is unusual because something like a blockade is usually not used against the weak, you know? But I do think, at least in theory and in practice to some degree, it can be mobilized for political dissent. And sure, why not, you know, take down the website? It doesn't maybe have a long-term impact, but it's good for publicizing an issue. But you've got to be careful as well. I mean, some government websites provide support and services during times of emergency, and maybe you don't want to take those down, but you want to take down another part of the government website that doesn't have those life-saving functions, you know? Yeah, I mean, it's sort of, you can say that they've been very good at garnering media attention. If nothing else, I've been doing interviews all day, and so, you know, people are interested in learning about it. I think they've really catalyzed the debate as to how you mobilize a large group of people to do digital dissent. So there have been small actions of virtual sit-ins in the past, but they were never really quite large. And so Anonymous shows, wow, maybe you can get a large group of people to do something like a street protest online. And so that opens the door for thinking about new possibilities at some level. I think when it comes to the Church of Scientology, which is a very kind of narrow issue at some level, but I do think Anonymous has been key in allowing people to be more public and less anonymous about the church when they're criticizing them. Prior to Anonymous, I had worked a little bit on past protests among geeks and hackers against the church, and I was extremely secretive about my work because I just didn't want to go through a lawsuit. And post-Anonymous, I was like, yeah, I'm just public about it. Anonymous really changed that. So in that domain, I think they've had a huge role to play. Definitely, some of them definitely are. And I mean, some are and then still enjoy that kind of culture of humor, grotesqueness, offensiveness from which they came. They don't see these as contradictory. Others seem to just want to provide a structure to allow others to engage in politics. They don't, except for the fact that creating structure, IRC, networks is their way of contributing. And of course, they've created a system where they can amass people at certain moments who could care less about politics but just want a DDoS, right? There are those people as well. But the people who are there long term, from what I can tell, you know, they do care about politics, and they've got ideals, and they've been transformed themselves as they've participated in this domain. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely, yeah. They have to work to keep their servers up as well. They get DDoSed a lot.